Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. We do have actually a little bit of news, though it's not quite as much as, of course, we had hoped. As you guys know, over the last 2, even 3 weeks, we've been kind of in the mood for, well, are we gonna get like the new iPhone 17e today? Are we gonna get M5 Pro and M5 Max MacBook Pros today? What are we gonna get? Well, how soon is iOS 26.4 coming? Is the new Siri coming with iOS 26.4? Obviously, as you guys can guess from the title and the thumbnail, I do have some not so great news about that expectation of ours, but I do want to also calm down some nerves because I've seen some people really share weird like statements about Siri and everything, as I think most of the AI crap right now weirdly overstates what's actually important for companies, what's actually like important for their bottom line. But yeah, obviously we do also have some competition talk. Samsung finally announced their Galaxy Unpacked for February 25th. With that, we are expecting the Galaxy S26 announcements. That's for the regular S26, S26 Plus, and Ultra. So some of the lineup changes where there would be a pro model, and if there would be a successor to the Edge, basically their Air model in the lineup from last year, that seems to have fallen flat. So we're getting a very typical, very baseline, I would argue very boring upgrade this year. So if you're looking at the face palm in my thumbnail, just between you and me, it honestly refers way more to the Samsung news than to the news about the Siri delay. And thankfully, because of Hardware Canucks, and I will have some criticisms about their testing. By the way, don't worry about my finger. I cut it yesterday with a box cutter at work. I'm stupid, I know. Uh, we already have Rosa in the chat. I see that. So thank you to everyone who finds their way to the streams, actually watches either now or live, comments. I know I haven't been great in the last few videos about adding timestamps. This video shouldn't be too long or complicated, so I hope I'll be actually able to structure it for you. And of course, you'll find also the link to our Discord. But yes, speaking of the Hardware Connects video, which we'll get to later on in the video, which I won't be watching fully. Don't worry, I'll just skip to like the 5 benchmarks that actually matter in that test. I'll also get to why I think Qualcomm is now notorious for wanting to have their cake and eat it too, the way they interact with us as consumers through the press as a middleman, where they let the press report super early on positive news, but obfuscate anything potentially negative, any kind of details that could bring down the hype, and they let that kind of cycle foster for like half a year, where you can build hype. Obviously, you don't owe us every single spec right away, but I do believe that the way that Qualcomm does has become particularly egregious, and that certain YouTubers like Hardware Canucks are playing into this, also sowing some confusion that actually can make Qualcomm to a degree look worse, because there's just a lack of understanding for us as consumers, and some that makes them look unjustifiably good. I'll just try to combat all of that. It's not that I have a particular beef with Hardware Canucks, it's just specifically their Qualcomm coverage, and I think the broader Qualcomm coverage in the tech media has been really going on my nerves, and I know you guys love yourself some chip coverage, so hopefully you'll be excited to see some benchmark between the Qualcomm Snapdragon X2 Elite and the Apple M5 from the latest MacBook Pro. I'm gonna shrink myself down as per usual. We have Benveni also joining the stream. Has been quite a while, man, since you've been able to join the stream. I know you are very active in the Discord. I know all of us are very worried about Discord, given all the face verification bullshit in there. So I still hope you guys can come here, interact. You don't even have to be super lively in the live chat, even though, of course, that would be my favorite thing. But just letting me know you guys are here, letting me know if you're enjoying the audio and video quality, see if there are any issues. That alone helps. Of course, leaving the like, subscribing to the channel if you haven't yet done so, sharing the video out with anybody who you think might enjoy it, and if you're particularly enjoying a video, consider leaving a super chat or super sticker right while I'm live. Some direct support goes a long way to help me make more of these videos. That way I can balance some of my work schedule versus some of this hobby stuff. And of course, you can also become a continued member right here on YouTube or on Patreon. Shout out to all our MarkTech Pro Max level supporters. That's Angelica, Steve, Max, and Jonathan. I know I abbreviate some of your names because some of them have numbers and whatever, but that's too complicated for me. I'll probably at some point should write them down. It's not much, definitely, but it's all very much appreciated. So let's actually start, and let's start with, of course, the biggest topic of yesterday, which came out pretty late in the day, so I wasn't able to stream about it. It does come from Mark Gurman, who of course has been very much like the single voice who has been telling us that iOS 26.4 is when we should expect the new AI Siri, right? He specifically even gave us details like first he said there would be a new Siri with iOS 26.4 that would be the Siri that brings personal context, on-screen awareness, and app interactions through app intent, right? That would be based on Apple Foundation Models 10, which are already at least partially designed with Gemini, but the real big breakthrough will come with Apple Foundation Models 11, which are built on top of Gemini 3, which is of course the latest version. In fact, just today they announced a pretty big release for Gemini 3 Deep Thinking without actually calling it like Gemini 3.1 or something like that. So if you're confused about some Gemini numbering stuff, I am too, to be quite honest. And that Siri, which Mark Gurman has thus far called new Siri, would basically be based on those newer models and be a full-on chatbot, including leverage Google's TPU-based cloud servers, because Apple's private cloud compute infrastructure either isn't powerful enough or just isn't sizable enough, however you want to look at that. And of course, on-device computation, just simply because of memory and power limitations, just is completely out of the question for an actual chatbot. Yeah, Benveni, I know you. Benveni actually gets a few brownie points here. He has been notorious on our Discord for actually claiming that he believes new Siri, that's the Siri that was promised for iOS 26.4, would only come with 26.5 or even later. So he has been retroactively proven right. Now, it should be noted, of course, none of this is officially confirmed, but it's very likely to be true. So this is coming from Mark Gurman reporting for Bloomberg. Apple planning to include the new capabilities in iOS 26.4, an operating system update slated for March. So this is also interesting. He did more recently commit to it being a March release. In the past, he actually has said that it would be between March and April, right? So the fact that iOS 26.4 launches in March, could it mean that like 26.5 would be like an April to early May release that could still have it? But he goes on here, so no reason right now to speculate. Apple is now working to spread them out, so this is important. Apparently, not all features are being delayed, at least not at the same pace. According to people familiar with the matter, I assume Gurman has pretty good sources and stuff like that. That would mean possibly postponing at least some features until at least iOS 26.5. So obviously there can be a worst case scenario where, God knows, maybe at some point some get released to iOS 27 or 26.6 or 7, right, which would be very close to the iOS 27 release pretty much anyway. It also depends, of course, which features. We'll get to some of that later on. I'll personally also comment on what AI features from Apple are actually important to me. I will be honest, all of the three features that Apple thus far has discussed for a first AI Siri are super important to me. A personal context, on-screen awareness. App intents, probably not so much because I just still prefer having the touch of controlling my apps by myself. Though I'm not even sure which feature is actually easier to implement, because at least App Intents has like APIs that are already built, right? It's up to third-party developers to implement some of that, but then ultimately making it work through Siri might not actually be as complicated as some of the other stuff. Gurman notes that while Apple hasn't promised a ship date, so that's important, thus far Tim Cook has repeatedly, including during quarterly earnings calls, he has committed to a release for the new AI Siri for 2026. So it could even be like iOS 27.1 would still not be a broken promise technically for this. The reason why we as a community have been talking so much about iOS 26.4 is very much because of this one man, Mark Gurman from Bloomberg. So whenever people are talking about a delay, this is not an official delay from Apple to us. This is an internal delay, and therefore it's a delay for us with our self-built expectations. One feature is especially likely to slip: the expanded ability for Siri to tap into personal data. That one would be probably my most important one. The fact that Siri would know just a lot about me, would be able to do all the data indexing on device, which happens anyway for things like Spotlight search and things like that. And that would give me for example, here's you could search old text messages to locate a podcast shared by a friend and immediately play it. Now, this to me would be less important, partially because honestly, I don't really share stuff like this that much. Also, a lot of what I share would be in apps like WhatsApp. So, plus a lot of what I do is multilingual. So, some of it is in German, some of it is in Russian, a lot of it is in English, some of it is like on a public social media website like Discord and Twitter. Some of it, of course, is iMessage and WhatsApp. Some of it's just my notes and reminders. So I'm not even sure if I'm a great candidate for that feature. But unfortunately, this seems to be the feature likely to be delayed, which, as I said, that makes something like App Intents probably the likeliest feature to actually launch. The report also says that the voice-based control of in-app actions is running behind. So that's basically where you can see, like, I'm speculating, app intents are very much, so that leaves pretty much on-screen awareness, right? That's actually like supposedly not delayed, right? On-screen awareness would be something that pretty much already exists in a way, but it relies on ChatGPT analyzing what's on your screen. And I guess given that text recognition and basic image recognition are not that difficult for AI these days, in fact, I would argue these are the things that are least like generative AI. They're actually solid algorithms behind them, especially for things like text recognition. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it also says voice-based control of in-app actions, but then my question is, what about app intents by themselves? Is Apple still pushing them to be adopted by third-party apps? Because they obviously can serve in something like shortcuts, right? Which, while a shortcut has to be built manually, that's still something that could be a voice-based activation, right? The more apps have support for app intents, the more likely it is that you can actually realize a feature like that through your voice, even if it's not like the most advanced Siri, unfortunately. Earlier today, Apple released iOS 26.3. Yeah, that's just a little bit of news recap. Also, unfortunately, on some personal news, this will actually be my personal phone for tomorrow and maybe the day after that. I'm actually going to the Apple Store and handing in my iPhone 17 Pro Max to get it either repaired or preferably replaced, because it has the speaker crack crackling issue that has been reported, and I've been very patient. I've tried out every beta, and I've waited for 26.3 to see if that would fix it. Apple thus far has not committed to any kind of formal fix for that issue, so I am very much, I've made an appointment, and I do hope to get my phone fixed / replaced, because 26.3 did not fix that, but 26.3 has a lot of good stuff, but it's very small. So all the truly big stuff is, of course, expected for 26.4, which now, thanks to the news that I presented to you just now, could slip to 26.5, 26.6, whatever, right? In 26.3, you're getting transfer to Android, basically an easy way if you, for some reason, want to switch from an iPhone to Android. This is a feature that's basically being forced upon Apple through regulatory agencies like here in Europe. Though from what I understand, it is actually a worldwide feature. So apparently, while Apple might have been forced by Europe to do this, they still decided to actually ship it worldwide, which is definitely a welcome choice. Health data, devices paired with Bluetooth, and protected items like locked notes are not transferred over to the new device. Google has also implemented a similar feature for transferring data from Android to an iPhone. So it's a two-way process between the two platforms, which I think we are also seeing stuff like that with Find My, and even to a degree with AirDrop, right? So the fact that Apple is giving some ground honestly has to beg the question if Apple might not be gaining more by actually telling Android users, your transition to an iPhone is easier than ever before. And while yes, it is also now slightly easier for an iPhone user to switch to Android, all historical trends point to the fact that most people do it one way, right? They switch from Android to iPhone. Maybe they keep an Android as like a secondary device or as like a work device. But usually once you go iPhone, you pretty much stick with iPhone, especially if you also happen to build yourself like a nice nest in the operating system. And one piece of data that recently came out that actually proves that point is the fact that iPhones have now hit almost 25% of active smartphones in the world. Or is that just America? No, it has to be. It cannot be America, right? Because America by itself would be like 40% or something like that. Shows, yeah, it's the global install base of active smartphones. Yeah, and you can see that. Like, despite Apple historically selling worse than Samsung now for like a decade, you can see that because of longer upgrades and because people just historically stick longer with their iPhones, they keep a higher resale value, there are more repair shops and stuff like that just focused on iPhones, there are fewer models making it easier to get parts, right? And as I said, historically, the amount of people switching from Android to iPhone has been basically always higher than the other way around, which has allowed Apple, despite selling less than 25% of worldwide smartphones, to get to that kind of install base. So a lot of factors helping Apple not just sell iPhones, but keeping them in circulation. This is why I also always fight ideas of like planned obsolescence bullshit and things like that. Not because I don't think that iPhones are built to last like 1,000 years or whatever, right? But I don't think that Apple deliberately builds in parts that just freaking break. There are parts that are by their very much chemistry and physics, like batteries, they will degrade over time, and that will lead to the situation that we've had with like battery gates. But very clearly, iPhones can last, right? And I'm not saying this because I have any skin in the game or whatever. For me, I don't own a single tech stock anymore. Before I got a little bit more serious about this channel, I have actually sold all my Apple stock. And soon after, I also sold most other tech stocks I owned. One of them, for example, the largest one that I held was BYD. BYD, the Chinese EV maker, right? Yes, obviously, if I had held to some Google stock or whatever, I could have made a lot of money during the AI craze. I actually never owned like Nvidia stocks or whatever. But yeah, I'm not saying this because I'm not an Apple sheep in the sense that like, oh, Apple's can celebrate, so I celebrate. I'm not seeing a penny of that money. In fact, if anything, Apple is seeing money from me, right? But I am trying to just combat prevailing narratives that I often see online, whether it's planned obsolescence or the fact that Apple is actually not as popular, because yeah, it might not actually be as popular worldwide as it is in the United States, where it has like 50% market share, but it's a very, very popular company and it's a very popular device. Benvini saying India is helping Samsung a lot with mid-range and lower tier phones. Exactly. That's why, for example, when we look at the worldwide top 10 in terms of sales, we usually get like 7 iPhones, and then we get like 2 completely low-end Galaxies, and then maybe the latest Galaxy S Ultra, right? But that also helps because the Galaxy S Ultra, by launching in January or February, has the entire year to accumulate sales. Meanwhile, the latest iPhone Pro, just after a month or two, right on the market, already gets to such a percentage of global sales that it completely outpaces the Galaxy S Ultra, anything from Xiaomi, anything from Oppo, anything from Vivo. These companies sell higher than Apple volumes often, though not necessarily last year. I believe Apple was the largest vendor of smartphones last year. But these companies primarily, even though they have great Pro and Ultra and now also Max devices, because everybody needs a Max in their lineup, whatever. But the majority of their sales is from lower end models. And then you see Google Pixel, whatever they're doing, man, it's just not working. If it were up to me, Google would quit the Pixel market. They would join forces with individual companies the way they did in the past. They would empower them to have a clean look, a much less bloated UI. They would give them their AI features. They would partner with them to give them some of the best-in-class AI for their cameras, and just let it be with your own hardware. You're just not meant to do that, bro. Sorry. But just to finish my thought on iOS 26.3, Riley joined the chat. Hello, man. For once, you actually didn't miss the chip talk. That is still to come. But yeah, 26.3, relatively small stuff. Weather wallpapers, limit precise location stuff. It's an option that only works with C1 and C1X modem. So the way Apple is building out their own stuff seems to be like really privacy focused on like a hardware level. So by the time Apple switches to like C2, C2X modems on iPhone, we're not just going to see efficiency gains, potentially performance gains, potentially new features. One of those I'll cover soon. But actually, Apple is, in my account, anybody who is like putting Apple on the same level as like Microsoft or Google or God forbid Facebook, right? When it comes to privacy, these people are like mentally deranged. Apple exists in such a different field when it comes to respecting privacy and security. And yes, it's small stuff like limiting carrier location capabilities, but it's still something, right? And then there are some other EU regulated features, but these are actually EU only. For example, notification forwarding, which allows incoming notifications on an iPhone to be forwarded to a third-party wearable device like an Android Wear smartwatch. So this is something that the EU is mandating. To be quite honest, I think that when it comes to basic notification forwarding, so it has very little privacy and security impact. It will only work when you pair it anyway, right? I think Apple should make that available worldwide. Should Apple work with Google to make sure that Android smartwatches work as well with iOS as the Apple Watch? quite honestly, and I know that sounds very anti-consumer, whatever bullshit, or very like bootlicky to Apple. No, I don't think so. I don't want Apple to waste their resources on this crap. I already don't like how many resources are being wasted on the digital markets app regulations in Europe. But at least I can respect, especially as a European, that the DMA, as flawed as it is written with good intentions, right? What I don't want to see is a profound rewriting of iOS security baseline, its compatibility, just to serve like, oh, you can pair this device with your iPhone, even though nobody really even wants to do that, right? And there is an 80% market share market, because don't forget, we just discussed how many iPhones there are in the world. The European Union is a big market and a strong money market, right? Especially with the euro doing pretty well. But when it comes to market share, Apple is not the top dog in Europe, right? We have a lot of Chinese competition. We do not regulate them down like the US, so they don't actually have a chance in the market. Samsung obviously is strong here, right? And I find it funny that Europe, where Apple has one of their lower market shares, especially for a developed region, right, an economically strong region, that Apple has to jump through all these hoops as if the people wouldn't have a choice to get something else, right? If you want your phone to work with an Android smartwatch, you're perfectly capable of buying an Android device. If you want like your PC to work perfectly with your phone, and it's an Android phone, don't buy a Mac, buy a Windows PC. Like, all these options exist, but yeah, we do have new features. We also have proximity pairing, something that I actually forgot completely. It's also Europe only. It's for third-party variables, which were shared by the European Commissions. Devices like headphones and smartwatches are able to use some of the same functionality available to the AirPods and the Apple Watch going forward. Proximity pairing allows third-party devices to pair with an iOS device in an AirPods-like one-step way, by bringing the accessory close to an iPhone or an iPad. I actually completely missed out on that. I forgot. I knew that they were asking for something like that, but I legit did not realize that this was something that was already built. So damn, that's even more resources taking away from Apple, which is funny because whatever I see, I usually see people pairing AirPods with Android devices, right? And I find it funny, but will Apple at least make it so that AirPods now also have a first-class experience on Android? Or is it basically just a burden on Apple? It's just the things I think about sometimes because, again, I do appreciate a lot of what the European Union does. I think taxes are better here. I think that environmental regulations are fairer here. I think worker protection rights are better here than in America. But some of this stuff definitely goes too far and is clearly written by Apple competitors rather than actual consumers who want these features. Because from all the people I know who use Android and third-party accessories, they don't expect any of this. But also iOS 26.3, macOS 26.3, they have a plethora of security updates. So make actually sure to update just because of that. But just from my own personal experience, as I've mentioned when I started talking about this, just because it's a new update does not mean it fixes all your issues. For example, for me, obviously the speaker crackling seems to be a hardware issue, but also Apple still hasn't fixed like the stutter for the control center on iPhone. It's funny because the control center animation is perfectly fluid on iPad and Mac, but on the iPhone, if you're scrolling to the second page of control center, it just creates like, if you are into games and like discussions from people like Digital Foundry, it looks like almost like a shader compilation stutter, right? Like it's an animation that needs to be buffered and saved. And in fact, once it does that, at least for a few hours, but usually for like a day, that animation stays fluid. It's only when you like restart your phone or it stays off for a little while, then it actually like has to redo that animation. And it's not true on the iPad, where it actually has the exact same animation, and it's not true on the Mac either, where the animation is quite different. So iOS 26.3, definitely a good upgrade just from the security updates alone. But I know most of you have been looking forward to iOS 26.4 and the new Siri AI features. So now it's a waiting game, right? We've been waiting for a lot of stuff, and I do want to mention positively something that many of you have waited for, especially those of you, of course, who own Apple Vision Pro. It's something that I've waited for, but I don't own Apple Vision Pro, so I'm not sure how much I actually benefit. But now there is a native YouTube app directly from Google for Apple Vision Pro. About time. They obviously made one when Samsung launched like their augmented reality headset, their VR headset. So I'm happy that they're doing this. I always believe Google is at its very best when they're honestly running on other hardware than their own. I also prefer obviously iOS and Apple and Vision OS vastly over whatever Google and Samsung created there. And it's not just a knee-jerk reaction. You guys know I've watched a lot of videos on this and stuff like that. So I'm very happy that people on the better headset get an app that I consider very much important, very much consequential to the choice of whether some people might actually buy a headset or not, right? Yes, there have been third-party YouTube solutions. Yes, of course, you could make YouTube work through the web, but a native solution will usually be more efficient, will usually have more features, will usually be more intuitive to use. And of course, unlike some third-party solutions, it will be free, minus stuff like YouTube Premium, of course. Now, I talked about stuff that we have waited for. Stuff that we continue to wait for is probably much closer than some of us even think. The iPhone 16e is about to turn 1 year old next week, and we are expecting the iPhone 17e to launch with a new processor, MagSafe, and newer modems inside. So like an N1 modem for Wi-Fi, a C1X, or who knows, maybe a potential C2 for cellular, but no big changes to the display, the notch. One thing I'm not quite sure about is the camera, whether or not it would get the camera like the front-facing 18 megapixel camera with the square sensor. That I'm actually not sure about. We've had very few leaks about that. But from everything that I can see is at least that the back camera will be very much technologically inferior. It is a much smaller sensor. I believe the sensor on the regular iPhone 17 is a 1 over 1.156 inch sensor, while this is a 1 over 2.5 inch sensor. So much, much smaller. In fact, it's pretty much the exact sensor that Apple uses for their ultra wide and telephoto cameras, and those are of course known to not have the same low light capabilities, not the same sharpness as Apple's main sensors, which on the Pros get even larger than on the base 17, 1 over 1.28 inches rather than 1 over 1.56. But yeah, we have talked about the specs, but now it seems that more and more people, including Bloomberg Smart Gurman, saying that the stock of iPhone 16e models has basically dried out, while the iPad Air is seeing shortages as well. We're obviously expecting an M4 iPad Air that will coexist quite nicely with the M5 iPad Pro. Basically a very natural choice, a little bit more power, more efficiency on the Pros, plus of course the Pros get you everything else, more speakers, better displays, right? So that will be nice to see, of course, but it is very much just a chip slot and upgrade. The iPhone 17e, while I would actually be pretty excited about it if it were actually getting a newer, more efficient screen and with it also a dynamic island design, I'm at least happy that Apple is fixing some shortcomings like the lack of MagSafe and much better Wi-Fi. For example, the current Wi-Fi chip is actually not even Wi-Fi 6E, it's just Wi-Fi 6, but it's also very inefficient by modern standards. So the iPhone 16e, despite having a smaller screen than the iPhone 17, despite having less brightness and everything, it performs worse in battery life, right? Even versus the 16, despite having a larger battery. So hopefully, while I would love to see a more efficient screen to also help out with battery life, definitely newer modems here will help a lot. In fact, Apple has also said that the C1X, if it's not a C2 even, is even more efficient than the C1. So it's not just a speed upgrade, it's also an efficiency upgrade. And thus far, the C1X is on the iPad Pro and the iPhone Air, right? So the Apple definitely will also benefit from just giving this piece of hardware to more devices, just so they can better leverage production and logistics. That's very much what happens over time. We're also waiting, of course, for a 12th generation basic iPad with an A18 processor. I also have, of course, advocated time and time again for the iPad to hopefully get compatibility with the Apple Pencil Pro, so we can finally get rid of that weird, like, USB-C to female lightning stuff, so you could make an Apple Pencil 1 work, and the Apple Pencil USB-C can stick around as a cheaper alternative. It's $50 cheaper, but even that is probably not what, like, it's just the quality of life between the USB-C Apple Pencil that has to be charged manually, that doesn't pair automatically with your iPad. I just think that the Apple Pencil Pro, even if you have to spend more money up front, will make you that much more happy. And in addition to just being more fun to use because of all of that, it also has more features. So, and the other device, and which goes hand in hand in that regard with the iPad Air, would be the M5 MacBook Air. But that one might probably depend on when Apple is willing to finally launch the M5 Pro and M5 Max MacBook Pros. We, of course, have already the M5 MacBook Pro out there. Yeah, at first I would expect iPhone 17e, new iPads, and maybe the MacBook Air, but definitely those two. Of course, we are still missing the new HomePod Mini, which supposedly is getting a MediaTek Wi-Fi chip, so it's not getting an N1, but then a HomePad, which is going to be like a premium HomePod with like an iPad mini style screen attached to it. That one, I think, is very much being married to the release of the new AI Siri. I don't think that Apple will risk launching it and getting bad early reviews, because the Siri in it needs to wait a month for new features. I think that Apple will only launch it when they at least have all the 3 new Siri features: personal context, on-screen awareness, and app intent controls. Out of all of them, for the HomePod, probably personal context is the most important one. But yeah, I just think that Apple will want to get Siri into much better shape before launching a device that's specifically built around a better Siri. And with iPad Air, MacBook Air, that will basically just depend on when their current supply dries out, because they obviously don't want to start selling a new device and then just be left sitting on a pile of iPhone 16es, M3 iPad Airs and stuff like that. So I very much believe that those devices could launch any moment, because whenever Apple will believe that their supply chain is exhausted enough, they'll just pivot to those new devices. It's just a chip swap. It's not complicated for them in any way to do, so they can even push production as much as they want. They can build as much upfront as they want and just keep them in warehouse until the last gen is sold out. So yeah, that one I definitely expect to be happening throughout February still, but at the latest throughout early March, which is also according to Mark Gurman when we should be expecting the M5 Pro and M5 Max MacBook Pro. Now, one hardware feature that I've been talking a lot about on this channel is, of course, Apple's push to new modems. And surprisingly, we even have more and more rumors and leaks about Apple's upcoming C2 modem. Now, I personally would even bet that this specific version that we are discussing might actually be called C2X, specifically because we are talking about the version for the iPhone 18 Pro family. I would assume that also applies to the iPhone Fold, though. I doubt that they would leave the iPhone Pros superior in terms of networking versus the iPhone Fold. But this one is getting a lot of new features, and one of those that we have discussed time and time again, because this is even something that Mark Gurman and Min-Chi Kuo have mentioned over the years, is millimeter wave support. Now, as a filthy European, millimeter wave support has absolutely no importance to me, but Apple continues to partner with US cellular providers like Verizon, and they want to still try to push millimeter wave. I guess that's why Apple keeps implementing them. Obviously, Qualcomm's modems have support for millimeter wave, so it doesn't hurt them to implement it. But it is, in my opinion, at least something that they should really very much deserve for the Pro models. There's no reason to burden the cheaper models with it, or the smaller, like more space-constrained models like the iPhone Air. In fact, I don't even think it makes sense on the iPhone Fold. Millimeter wave consumes more energy, has worse signal strength and all that stuff. But one other feature that seems like Apple is very much leading the market on, because as you know, with the iPhone 14, Apple has pushed a lot of safety features over satellite connectivity. But now they're going beyond that and not just sending SMS messages and potentially doing calls. Well, now we might be getting actual 5G satellite connectivity, like 5G, right? The actual internet stuff. Now, this is coming from Fixed Focus Digital, one of the Weibo leakers that we follow here on this channel. And apparently, the iPhone 18 Pro models will support NR, NTN, or new radio and non-terrestrial networks. So it's a new standard, but the way it's being implemented will very much depend on the device. It also looks like it's not going to be cheap, but it seems to be something that Apple is very much pushing. It will probably also down the road be a good argument for Apple to even invest maybe in some kind of form of their own networking. If it's not directly run by Apple, Apple could make sure that some kind of satellite internet provider could provide internet to people in war-torn areas, in areas with high prosecution, in areas where there are natural disasters, right? So that people either temporarily or even across the year could access internet without being reliant on a carrier. Now, it's very likely that this will still need a carrier. Basically, it's like a middleman, and this is still separate from the idea of using satellite 5G to like capture it with transmission towers and then give it to your phone. This is directly with your phone communicating with satellites. In fact, Apple is also working to make the antenna so strong that it actually takes away the necessity to like point your phone towards the sky, which is currently necessary for the emergency satellite-based features that Apple has. So this is really cool. I hope it also is, of course, efficient. This is also something that the information has reported on, which, while the information is not the greatest source, Wayne Ma is a decent leaker. Bloomberg Smart Government has corroborated some of that and referenced it. Now, whether it actually means that that feature will be ready by the time iPhone 18 Pro comes out, or it might be delayed, whether it means it might be delayed to a later software release, or even to a completely new device like the iPhone 19 family, that remains to be seen. We often have reports that struggle to understand the exact timeline that Apple is pushing. Obviously, we just discussed that for a software feature like the new AI Siri, but it happens with hardware as well. So it's something like, take it with a pinch of salt, like not a mountain, like I sometimes tell you, depending on the rumor, but it is something that I'm very much excited about. The only thing that makes me less excited about it is it probably means putting a lot more money into Elon Musk's SpaceX, but I'm willing to live with that because Europe is also pushing their own stuff. Global Star is obviously the satellite provider that Apple currently relies on. So by the time this feature actually is in full force, we could see this actually being much more versatile. While currently all of Apple's emergency satellite features rely on Global Star, maybe in a couple of years, 5G satellite connectivity could be partially based on everything from Starlink to Amazon satellites that they're sending into lower orbit, to the Chinese endeavors that are pretty much copying what is being done here, to like some European efforts there's a French company called Eutelsat doing that. So yeah, there's a lot to definitely look forward to in that regard, and I'll keep you guys posted, of course. Now, we have discussed, of course, a lot of competition here on this channel about Apple. For Apple, we talked about the latest Xiaomi devices, Vivo devices. I always bring up spec points that I like Apple to copy. Sometimes it's like a really large camera sensor. Sometimes it's discussions about like silicon carbon batteries, right? There's a lot that Apple can and should do to compete better. But obviously, if you look at the broader market, including the statistic that I showed you recently with iPhone, like worldwide share of smartphones, Apple is doing pretty well for themselves. And Apple's biggest worldwide competitor is, of course, Samsung. And Samsung is, of course, about to launch the Galaxy S26 series. Now, I should mention that that means the Galaxy S26 series is launching about a month late during the year than they did last year, or even historically that they've done throughout the last couple of years. So last year we had an event late January, or I believe early February, but I'm almost willing to bet it was late January. Now we're looking at late February as an event and then an early March launch. And given that we are looking at a longer upgrade cycle from the Galaxy S25 family to the S26 series, one might ask, well, what are we getting out of that, right? How big is it as an upgrade? And to be quite honest, and by the way, if I scroll poorly, please forgive me. That's because my finger is cut. I have to say, this is probably the most disappointing and most like boring release for a Galaxy device in years. And I am willing to accept, like, for example, the iPhone 16 Pro was not a huge change over the iPhone 15 Pro in some ways, but it did have better battery life. Of course, it had a faster processor and all that stuff. But one of the reasons for that was because the iPhone 15 Pro just the year before obviously got a redesign around titanium and stuff like that. Just the year before that, the iPhone 14 Pro got a dynamic island display and a 48 megapixel main camera. Just the year before that, the iPhone 13 Pro, of course, got ProMotion. So these things accumulate, and you can argue, oh, Apple waited too long with ProMotion. The only reason it was a marketing point is because they held off so long for it. Sure, but it works, right? Samsung does not compete with specs directly against Apple. They're competitors in that field, especially if Samsung wants to keep their market share in markets like India. Like, that's Chinese stuff, right? That's the Xiaomi 17 Pro and Ultra and Max, whatever the final name is going to be for the premium model, right? It's going to be the Vivo X200 family. These devices have like 7,500 milliamp hour batteries. They have gigantic vapor chambers. Some of them have full 1-inch sensors. Some of them have the same sensor size that Samsung uses for their main camera, but they use it for their telephoto, right? So there is a lot that Samsung could be doing, like technology that objectively exists out there, technology that competitors are already utilizing, competitors that are usually actually pricing their devices lower than the Galaxy S Ultra. But it seems like Samsung is having very little of that. So some of the bigger changes, of course, we're looking at we're looking at One UI 8.5. We are finally looking to a switch to a 10-bit display because, yes, believe it or not, despite Samsung being one of the leading suppliers of OLED screens in the world, across smartphones, across monitors and stuff like that, they actually kept their flagship on an 8-bit panel, despite even, for example, iPhones having 10-bit panels for about 3 years now, right? So like, this has been an absolute embarrassment, and I'm very much happy that they're correcting it. Now, one feature where Samsung has actually been leading is low reflectivity, at least low reflectivity without killing like the actual vibrancy of the screen. I would still argue that the screen on the Galaxy S Ultras recently has been a little bit too much muted to me. Not in the sense that it's as bad as even Apple's nano texture, which I don't like how that looks. And obviously, when you look at like matte screen options, those are completely horrible and unacceptable to me. So Samsung has done a good job, but it's not something that I would buy a new phone for. But one thing that they're adding to their array of display tricks is a privacy display. Either all of the screen is fully visible or all of it has restrictive viewing angles so that you can see it head on, but people keeping over your shoulder can't see anything. Samsung has come out with a way to control this on a per pixel level. The Samsung Galaxy S26 Ultra, also important, only the Ultra, will be able to set pop-ups with sensitive info to private, which will make it hard or next to impossible for others to read if they're obviously not like. It should be noted, like, this would be a different angle, right? But if somebody obviously has their face directly over your shoulder, like right there, they would be able to read that. But that's obviously not Samsung's fault. That's then for you to control. Yeah, is it something that I really need? Like, for example, this is said like, oh, it's for an unlock code or whatever. Given that most of us use like fingerprint sensors and face ID technology, it's just not something that very much interests me. But I'm like, my issue is I would love to see features like that if Samsung were to actually continue pushing the envelope, right? They were to give us some of the best-in-class cameras, and they were to give us some of best-in-class battery life or some of best-in-class passive cooling, some of best in class either charging. I'm fine, to be honest, with 45 to 60 watts, but even then Samsungs are not actually really good at maintaining that peak speed. So in the end they still charge notably slower than a lot of Android competitors, and not actually that much faster than Apple when Apple maxes out at 35 watts. So Apple is much better at holding their peak because they do not overpromise on that peak, right? But when we're actually looking at the entire lineup, wait, I thought I had actually opened everything here. So, of course, these devices are switching to the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5. They'll have 12 gigs, well, specifically the Ultra will have 12 gigs of RAM on the 256 gigabytes and 512 gigabyte configurations. And then the 1 terabyte model will have 16 gigabytes. This is actually something that I think is actually really, really bad for Samsung, because historically, when you think about storage and especially RAM, there were times when Samsung offered you 3 to 4 times as much RAM as a comparably priced iPhone. Now, when you actually look at the base configuration, sure, if you want to compare the Galaxy S26 and S26 Plus to the base iPhone 17, yeah, 12 gigabytes is more than Apple's 8. Though 256 gigabytes is the same storage baseline. But on the Ultra, we are looking at the same RAM amount as an iPhone Air, which is $300 cheaper. We're looking at the same RAM amount as the iPhone 17 Pro, which is $200 cheaper. And we're looking at the same RAM amount as the iPhone 17 Pro Max, which is still $100 cheaper, right? And sure, you could argue by the time you reach 1 terabyte, you're finally getting a little bit more RAM. But really, man, is that what you want to advertise? In years where Apple has actually not upgraded, has not asked for more money, and there is actually a chance that the pricing here will now be dangerously close to the iPhone. Like, we're looking at 1469 euros for the S26 Ultra. If you actually look at apple.com/de. Like, usually when we are looking at American prices, yes, iPhones are cheaper even a little bit, right? But that's because it's their home market. Apple is very advanced, like logistics in the United States. Apple does not want to give that market in any way to a competitor, right? But look at what that means now, right? The iPhone 17 Pro Max is $1,449, right? That's with 256 gigs of storage, and that's with 12 gigs of RAM. Now, don't forget, European prices include, here in Germany, it's a 19% value-added tax, right? Here, we're looking at $20 more for the same RAM and storage, for a chip that's actually in some ways slower. Yes, in multi-threaded, it's faster, but Samsung usually doesn't even have the thermals to maintain any of those peak multi-threaded capabilities. It's really not great. Now, there is one notable camera upgrade, which should be noted. The Galaxy S26 and Galaxy S26 Plus do not have any notable camera upgrades, so maybe your final photos will look better because they're being processed by a better chip with a better image signal processor, though these devices are also more likely to come with the Exynos chip rather than the Qualcomm chip. So we'll have to see how good that chip is at actually like beyond just raw performance, raw efficiency, GPU power, things like that, ray tracing capabilities, AI capabilities, but also things like image signal processors. How will that impact devices that haven't gotten like notable camera upgrades in years and years? When you look, for example, for the Ultra, we see some stuff that's pretty similar, like the periscope solution here. Apple's is a 120 millimeter zoom, but the sensor size is pretty similar and the aperture is pretty similar. Obviously with the 5x zoom. Now, Apple does have notably better image stabilization on their telephoto camera, which usually gives you much better low light conditions, especially with anything moving, but just in general low light. Now, with the second zoom camera, that's garbage. That's a 10 megapixel 3x optical zoom. So I know some people have speculated this would be like a larger sensor, 12 megapixel, whatever. Seems like that's not being true. The ultra wide, that's also technologically similar to Apple's. Apple has a worse aperture, f2.2 versus Samsung's f1.9. That usually results in Samsung having better low light performance on its ultra wide than Apple. Hopefully Apple is encouraging encouraged by that to finally upgrade the actual optics on their ultra wide. I would also argue they need at least a 1/2-inch sensor to make it work. Now, the only notable camera upgrade here, don't forget, for example, the iPhone's front camera is now miles ahead, even on the base iPhone 17, than any of these phones. Apple's camera is higher resolution, it's wider, it's square, so it doesn't matter whether you're taking a portrait or a landscape selfie. It's a larger sensor. It's a 1/2.5-inch sensor. It's better in like literally every way than this. So the only potential camera advantage of the Galaxy S26 Ultra is going to be its 200 megapixel main camera with its f1.4 aperture. So this is the most notable change over the previous generation. The sensor size actually stays the same. It's ever so slightly smaller than the iPhone. As I said, the iPhone is 1/1.28 inches. This is 1/1.3. To be more precise, I think it's 1/1.31, but you can round that down, doesn't really matter. But the notable change here is a much wider aperture, something that Apple is also being rumored to bring to the iPhone 18 Pro series. Here we are looking at the fixed f1.4 aperture, which should let it notably more light than the previous f1.7 or f1.8 solution. The iPhone is at f1.78, so this should, minus the chance that Apple's optical image stabilization, which Apple uses not just optical but actually sensor shift image stabilization, it should be that Samsung overcomes some of the low light deficits that they have right now versus the iPhone 17 Pro. So I know some people prefer Samsung's low light photography. I think these people are insane. These could actually help. But yeah, in my opinion, they should just remove this bullshit, use whatever money they have to give these two larger sensors, and I'm willing to give this a chance. This sounds at least like one solid upgrade, but of course we'll have to wait and see. And yes, the selfie camera now remains very disappointing in that regard. Interestingly, we're looking at Bluetooth 5.4, not at Bluetooth 6, which is usually what I would associate with a Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 chip. Maybe there is some discrepancy because some devices are Exynos 2600 based and might be using a Samsung based modem for it. But at least it's Wi-Fi 7. They do mention Face ID, which obviously is a software solution. It's not like Apple's. We're looking at a slightly larger battery on the base model, 4300 milliampere hours, which is honestly very necessary because the peak power consumption of the 8 Elite Gen 5, even you can overall claim that the 8 Elite Gen 5 is more efficient than its predecessor. It's just, it consumes a lot of power and it generates a lot of heat. And this is why I hate these specs, the fact that these devices are actually trying to be thinner than last generation. I think you would be much better off making this like 180 grams, this like around 200, giving this like 4500 at least milliampere hours, giving this at least 5200, and giving them both larger vapor chambers. This is embarrassing, the fact that this is limited to 25 watts wire charging. That makes it a slower charger with a larger battery than Apple's base iPhone 17. And then, of course, the main disappointment for me is the battery capacity on the Galaxy S26 Ultra. Again, this device is almost 20 grams lighter than the 233 grams of the iPhone 17 Pro Max. It's thinner. It has absolutely no reason to be, right? Like 60 watts wire charging, that's nice, but given everything we know about Samsung, it's probably not going to be able to sustain that peak. And when you look at the Xiaomi 17 Pro Max in that category with like 7,500 milliampere hours. If you look at OnePlus with about the same capacity, if you look at Vivo with 7,000, It's just embarrassing. And don't forget, a lot of these devices, they do get a massive bump in battery life because obviously 50% more capacity will give you more battery life. But these devices, because of the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 or sometimes the Dimensity 9500, they don't always get 50% more battery life. They'll get like 30% more battery or even 25%, which is still great, don't get me wrong, but you're now keeping the same battery with a device that now has a more power consumption modem chip. I'm sorry, and while the screen might be more efficient, yes, but we are looking at a newer generation LTPO panel. We are looking at something that's probably like a quarter of a generation ahead of what's in the iPhone 17 Pros and whatever. So Samsung will probably get to higher brightness. But what are you going to then do at that higher brightness? Because usually higher brightness still comes with disproportionately more power consumption. Yes, maybe with a more efficient screen, you can mitigate that by like 10% or something like that. But if you're going to push 1,000 extra nits from your screen, that will come with higher power consumption. And you're doing literally nothing to offset that. In fact, if you're looking at regions like North America, I've already talked about how the iPhone Pro Max is cheaper than the Galaxy S Ultra with the same amount of base RAM and storage, which has historically never been the case. But the iPhone also now, in markets like North America, has a larger battery. Apple has 5,088 milliampere hours, and yes, it's 4,800 something in regions here like Europe, but it's still fucking embarrassing. That's because obviously here we get the SIM card tray version. I hope that next year Apple changes their mind and gives Germany the eSIM version, or at least gives us the option. But yeah, with Samsung, if you really want great battery life, you're probably now looking at like making it work. Also to further like criticize this, because we've talked about stuff like wire charging. Wireless charging apparently is not getting a huge upgrade. It does not, for example, get Qi 2 magnets inside the actual device, so you'll still rely on cases for making Qi 2 work. So we've talked about Apple adding MagSafe to the iPhone 17e. That's a $600 product. That's less than half the starting price of the Galaxy S26 Ultra. And Samsung, it does not have it built in. You'll have to buy a case that has that and then keep that case on, which even if you have a case, by the way, that has Qi 2, from everything that I've seen, it still is more efficient to just wirelessly charge your phone naked, right? So even though you need that case to get those magnets, it will make your wireless charging worse. And you already don't have anywhere near to close to class-leading battery life to begin with, wireless charging to begin with. And even when we look at, by the way, at the base iPhone here, right? This is where it actually, in my opinion, gets pretty embarrassing. iPhone 17, right? That's $50 less expensive. And yes, you're getting less memory at that, you're getting less RAM at that price, and you're getting one fewer cameras. But across the board, you're getting a better main camera because while yes, they are similar. They have a similar sensor, but this, for example, has a wider aperture, and just historically, Apple's it has better image stabilization. It has now an ultra wide that's very similar in capabilities. Plus, again, Apple's better, in my opinion, ISP on top of that. This one might have a smaller battery inside, but has a much more efficient processor. It has MagSafe for all the accessories, wireless charging. It actually has now better wire charging. In my opinion, it also has a much nicer button situation with the action button and volume and camera control, right? While Samsung is notorious for like not giving you enough buttons. I know camera control has been controversial with some people. I still think it's way better to have it than not have it. And I think this device is just such a no-brainer. And especially if you're going to compare it like in something like the US market where there's like $100 price difference between them. It's just in a completely different league of better value, which is honestly insane to say. Right, so and we don't even know if the base S26 and S26 Plus are getting all the screen updates. So it might be that the iPhone 17 base model might end up with a brighter, better LTPO panel in general. So yeah, this while in prior years I would bring up some of the pros and cons, I think if you're looking at a small compact device, there's absolutely no contacts. The base iPhone 17, especially given now that you can even get it with a little bit of a discount because it has been on the market for months, yeah, it's way better than the Galaxy S26, at least in my opinion. Again, feel free to counter me. But that's my opinion, and I think it's actually pretty well founded in actual facts. Now, before I give you a few benchmarks, because I know that people like Riley come here for his, exactly that. No big news here. We've covered actually quite a lot in a little just over an hour. Guys, if you're watching this and you're enjoying this, please consider subscribing to the channel, like like the video, share it out with anybody who you think might enjoy it. Man, where did I put my water bottle? Oh, it's exactly behind my laptop, so I actually couldn't see it. So subscribe, like, share, comment. You guys know I love interacting with a lively comment section. Beyond all that, consider leaving a super chat or super sticker while I'm live to support me directly, or consider becoming a channel member right here on YouTube to support me in the long term. Again, shout out to all our MarkTech Pro Max supporters. But without further ado, because I do want to preserve my voice and I do want to preserve some energy, so at 11 p.m. I can actually watch the state of play from PlayStation, which should have some notable first-party announcements, so I'm looking forward to that. But I know you guys never watch me for any of my PlayStation coverage, so I'm keeping that one for myself. But yes, Hardware Canucks did a video on the Snapdragon X2 Elite chip. Now, it should be noted, this is not the X2 Elite Extreme. This is like a couple notches below, but it should be in the ballpark. So its clock speeds should be lower across CPU and GPU. It should also have a smaller memory bus, so that will be a bottleneck for certain GPU tasks. But beyond that, it does have about the same core layout and things like that. Also, depending on the device you're buying, the difference in price and the difference in power consumption, and potentially with it the difference in like battery life, this is actually the more sensible X2 Elite. Now, I know some people will say, when I look at the numbers and compare it to like the M5, some people will say, well, there is an even more premium X2 Elite. And I'm like, yes, but for that, we're actually looking at at a device with much more power consumption, completely different cooling solutions, potentially lower battery life. And if you're willing to accept that, get an M5 Pro MacBook Pro, because there's a good chance that that will actually launch still before Qualcomm devices. Now, the Silicon Frame joining the stream saying propaganda for Qualcomm. And I actually completely agree. I've mentioned that when I started the stream. I think, because, mind you, the review embargo for the X2 Elite is nowhere near over. We don't have final products. We do have like the rough outline of those products, right? That will have the X2 Elite. But even in this video, for example, they will mention stuff like, oh, battery drivers are not final. That's why we didn't test battery life. And I'm like, yes, but you understand that maybe for the end goal of better battery life, maybe the final chip performance will actually be a little lower, right? So keep that in mind, because they're basically giving Qualcomm, and yes, Silicon Frame, you're calling this propaganda. I just call it unjustified benefit of the doubt, because so much of Qualcomm promises have basically been something like that. We give you the absolute highest number for the highest end configuration, maybe one that will even be hard to get, one that's power consumption and energy efficiency is completely out of line with what you would actually want from a thin and light. Like I believe for the X2 Elite Extreme, they had like 120 watts like TDP for CPU and GPU combined. This is something that rivals Apple's M Max chips, in fact stands above them, right, in terms of power and cooling needs. And some people want to compare it to the base M5, which, and obviously if you obfuscate all that, because you're just giving us benchmark charts, you're not giving us battery life numbers, you're not giving us therefore efficiency stats, like how many hours of browsing do you get for per watt hour of battery capacity, right? All those issues. And I just find it like, what's the actual impact of video watching versus actually like doing something more energy intensive? How much energy does the actual GPU use? Now, there's this is something that I got because I am still on Twitter. God help me. But this is something absolutely disgusting here, which is these guys will actually mention a power consumption number, which is just the TDP. They'll just mention 31 or 33 watts for the last gen X Elite and the X2 Elite, the new one. And then on Twitter, they came out and said, oh, yes, these numbers, they aren't actual power consumption numbers, but from the wall, though all of those devices were just using 45 watts. And once I read that, I knew, by the way, they are totally lying. And not even in favor just of Qualcomm, because right in here, they're also testing a Panther Lake laptop. And we know that at peak, Panther Lake, the 16-core Max version, can go up to 70, 75, even 80 watts of power consumption. Thanks to actual review websites like Notebook Check, we know these numbers. But they just wanted to obfuscate that and tell us, oh yeah, all of those laptops, they use all 45 watts from the wall. No, that's complete garbage, and all power consumption numbers here are complete garbage as well. Even the fact that they just standardize one number for the M5. If you know how Apple Silicon works, GPU notoriously consumes less wattage than the CPU at peak. I apologize. I got a little excited, and I was still very sick last week, so my voice hasn't fully recovered. And I did spend almost 5 hours on the phone call yesterday, plus work and everything. And the cold air and then the air-conditioned air, it's just not great for my throat. But let's actually get started. Now, as I said in the beginning, I do not actually want to watch this entire video. One thing, I definitely do not want to watch it at regular speed, right? But I do want to answer some of the things that they are saying. And then once they just get into like breaking down the X2 Elite lineup, as they've done, by the way, numerous videos before, though I think they've actually deleted those videos. You're free to correct me on that one if I'm wrong. Yeah, but I just wanted to be forthright, tell you most of my opinion beforehand, and that way we also have to watch less of the video, and that reduces the chance that I'm breaking my voice completely.
You believe that we are going on a year and a half with the current generation of Qualcomm Snapdragon processors?
Well, it's actually not that long, no, because, oh, well, yeah, it is that long, but that's because they actually were announced like 2.5 years ago, right? And then it took them like an eternity to actually bring them to market. Didn't prevent guys like you from actually hyping them up, even though it took them like 9 months to launch. By that time, they had different competitors like Lunar Lake and HX370 APUs, right? You're doing the same thing again. You're enabling them to make people wait for like half a year. It's maybe not as bad as it was with the original X Elite. And Of course, there are all the Windows on ARM issues. Now, I do not fault like the likes of Hardware Canucks for those issues. I think they still cover them, not as much as I think they should. But yeah, it's I do not want to hate on them entirely, but this is a bad video.
Snapdragon X1 Elite series was launched a year and a half ago. So what Qualcomm realized is that it was high time to quickly transition into their next generation of processors. And what they've done, on paper at least, is something very, very interesting. They have gone from this type of performance on the last generation to this. And this.
Oh, Jesus Christ. So,
to this.
So these numbers, they are not actual power consumption tests. This is basically TDP. Yes, the X2E, this is the direct successor, by the way. So there are, as I said before, higher end models that will probably give you another 5 to 10% more performance, but at the cost of way more power consumption. We see that like the way that that curve bends from like geek events testing of both the original X Elite and of course the 8 Elite Gen 5, which is of course going to be the architecture that the X2 Elite is based on. So these power consumption numbers, the idea that it's just 50% more efficient, look, it can be possible. The main reason for that is because this chip has a lot more cores to spread out its workload. It's for that reason, for example, why the M5, while the M4 Pro does not actually consume, well, it consumes more energy than the M4, but not as much more as you would think, because what it does by using more cores, it targets slightly lower clock speeds during multi-threaded performance, and therefore uses those cores in a much more efficient way. This is, of course, something that could also be reflected here. Do I expect it to be 50% more efficient? I mean, there are more generational jumps here than just from the way that we see from more regularly upgraded processors like their smartphone 8 Elites. Do I believe it's just flat out 50% more? It's probably gonna be below that.
And this to this.
Yeah. This one is actually not surprising at all, because this actually was notoriously bad in GPU. I also don't actually ever remember this one using 33 watts. I actually think this one was always like wattage starved. So you also see, by the way, whenever they use like the same number for the CPU and GPU, later on they will also use the same number for the single core results as they will for the multi-core results. You know that these are not actual power consumption stats, but this is just TDP.
And basically talking about what they've done and how they've done it is what this video.
So I don't care how they've done it. That one is where Silicon Frame was correct. That one is just propaganda, because at some point it's fine. Like GeekEvent does chip breakdowns as well. They do it for Apple. They do it for Qualcomm. But I just think that the way these guys have done so much coverage for Qualcomm and so many of the same videos basically with, oh, it's a new laptop with the Qualcomm X Elite, so let us break down the lineup again and again and again, right? So much attention and so much time given to it. I don't care about that. We know that there are more cores here. The highest end version also has higher memory bus. Obviously, there's a new architecture at play. Yada da da da.
Performance beta, you can find these things under our that sure exactly what might not.
Wait, did they? Oh, it's because it's a downloaded video. That means it doesn't have like timestamps. So you can also see like, yeah, like for a non-review, they're definitely like talking a lot, like, which is weird for me, because usually if you have only a few numbers, you wouldn't make like a 15-minute video, but okay.
Specifically when the A14 is running under battery. So let's line things up against the previous generation X Elite, Apple's M5, and Intel 280V, and AMD's Ryzen AI 9 HX3.
So this is Panther Lake. This is Lunar Lake. This is AMD's Strix Point, but it's basically the same as AMD's newer Gorgon Point. This one is using Intel 18A for the CPU and the 3 nanometer TSMC node for the GPU. This one is TSMC 3 nanometer across the board. This is a 4 nanometer SoC, and these are both N3P chips.
70. I also want to mention the A14 doesn't have Qualcomm's highest-end flagship Extreme processor.
Yep.
Instead, it's the X2 Elite, so the lowest-end 18-core CPU in the new Snapdragon line.
Which I hate that. Like, it's the lowest-end 18-core CPU, but it still has all the cores. They're just clocked a tiny bit lower than on the highest end. And the same is true, by the way, for the GPU. From everything that I've seen, the switch to the 100, because this is one spec point that they don't actually break down, the exact GPU core count. I know that they clock their GPU cores higher on the version with a 192-bit bus, but I'm not sure if they actually have more cores. And unless there is a severe bottleneck in terms of memory bandwidth, you're basically just gonna get extra performance from the extra clock speeds.
All of these processors were set to operate at a normalized 30 watts, except
so there's no way to do that. Like, I'm sorry, like, their balance profiles, their performance profiles, some of these chips do not even get full of their performance when outside of battery. Why would you normalize them at 30 watts instead of just looking at like a regular consumer behavior? This is just complete garbage to me. Again, this goes also back to like they've all been using 45 watts, which like that's not even how these laptops operate. Like some of them have way faster chargers. Again, Panther Lake can use up to 75 watts. When you look at this is the high-end version with the full 12-core GPU, with the full 16 cores. This is not a chip that's maxing out at 30 watts. If you're artificially limiting it to 30 watts, I don't know why. I think that's a bad test. But I also just don't believe you, to be quite honest.
M5, which runs a little bit lower than that in all of our tests. Anyways, Cinebench, it aligns almost perfectly with Qualcomm's numbers in single-core and multi-core results. But look.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I still think that the actual power consumption numbers, given that we've seen like the X2 Elite Extreme actually use like 80 watts or whatever on the CPU, and that one is just like clocked 10% higher. Do you really think that 10% makes up the difference from like 30 watts to 80? No, that's just not the case, and I'm sorry to anyone who believes that. Apple's M5 actually being realistic, well, for one, it's the fastest one that's already out. One thing that I don't like is that the Panther Lake chip seems to be notably behind here. From everything that I see, Panther Lake in terms of multi-threaded results actually gets really close to the results of the M5, which makes sense, mind you. This is a 10-core CPU with 4 performance cores and 6 efficiency cores. This is a 16-core CPU with 4 performance cores, 8 efficiency cores, and 4 low performance efficiency cores. So maybe you can even slightly ignore those extra 4 cores because they might not be as well leveraged by apps like Cinebench, but they still add a little bit, and that's why we get, usually at the cost of much higher power consumption, we get numbers that roughly match the Apple M5, and obviously it comes under the M4 Pro in both efficiency and final results. I think the Bint M4 Pro would still be above this. I can actually look that up. Sorry, I actually have to type in my password because my finger is bandaged, and that's my Touch ID finger on my Mac. Geekbench 6 M4 Pro. So hopefully it gives us... yeah, obviously this one is... well, this is Geekbench, so the numbers are different. I just need a rough scaling thing. Or you know what? I'm just going to M4 Pro. Cinebench 2024. Usually there's a website called CPU Monkey that gives you that. That's 12 CPU cores, so that's 8 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. That's the bin down version. And yes, you can see it comes in higher than the 18 core X2 Elite. So just saying, obviously single core performance will also be a discussion once we get to that. There is a 14 core M4 Pro, should be noted here. That one has 10 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. And then the M4 Max has 12 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. So there is definitely like wiggle room here for it to beat the X2 Elite. No, plus, of course, we do have newer tests like Cinebench 2026. I mean, we can actually look into some of that. Yeah, but I'm not sure if they have provided any such numbers. Let's get back to the actual test.
That was pretty much expected here, since this benchmark is basically the cornerstone of...
Yeah, so this is one thing, by the way, like, and this is, like, they promised 160 for the highest end version. And that could still be happening if it's truly 10% higher clocked, though that's a little bit much. It would also suggest that there is no IPC loss at those higher frequency. I could see it being maybe closer to 155, maybe the highest, like if you actually give it like 85 watts or something like that, yeah, it will be 160. Obviously, if we look now at, and I'm actually gonna look here at the M4, Cinebench 2024, single core, right? DM4 already is faster here across the board. It's 10% faster than even the fastest one. And then, yes, the Apple M5 comes in at 200, a nice generational uplift, especially considering that this one is actually lower clocked than this one. Though, from what I know, this should be a 4.4 gigahertz clock, not a 4.3. We can actually look at, I think I've closed the Geekbench one. Geekbench M5 MacBook Pro. I think that should give us a 4.4 gigahertz frequency, if I'm not mistaken. 4,300 in single core score, a completely like just unmatched. Oh, it's 4.6. Okay, so the scaling is then a bit more frequency, but also a bit more IPC. So they just got it wrong on CPU Monkey here. This is why I always like to view multiple sources, not just multiple YouTubers, but actual multiple websites. Yeah, 4.6 gigahertz does make sense. There is some speculation that maybe M5 Pro, M5 Max could push it to 4.8. And yes, I believe the M5 on the iPad Pro is actually at 4.4 gigahertz. So that's only a small bump up over the M4 as in the previous iPad Pro. We can actually look at that too. Geekbench M5 iPad Pro, and I believe that one should be at 4.4 gigahertz. We see slightly lower performance here, and we see 4.25 gigahertz. That's lower than what I remember. And we see 4.43 gigahertz. So yeah, there's some difference here, definitely. I'm not sure if there was like maybe a wrong reading while it was on iOS 26.0, but yes, 4.4 gigahertz for iPad Pro M5, 4.6 gigahertz for the M5 MacBook Pro, and by that logic, maybe M5 Pro and M5 Max could give you another 200 megahertz on top of that. Definitely M4 Pro had slightly higher clock speeds too, as far as I remember. We can actually look that up because Geekbench is definitely correct. So if we are looking M4 MacBook Pro first, we are looking at 4.5 gigahertz Really? No, that's not the M4, or that's the M4 Pro. Uh, and that one should then be 4.4, right? Yeah. So M4 Pro was 100 megahertz higher clocked. Now we even have difference between chips that have the same name, like between the M5 and the iPad Pro and the MacBook Pro. So who knows how much extra clock speed we might get, if any, from M5 Pro and M5 Max over the M5 in the MacBook Pro. In fact, one thing that will also be interesting, if the M5 in the MacBook Air is going to be clocked more like the M5 in the iPad Pro or more like the M5 in the MacBook Pro. So that's a lot of numbers for you guys to work with, but I hope nobody's being too confused.
All of their claims. Still though, let's be honest here. This kind of performance uplift in a single generation is huge.
I mean,
Moving
that's
outside of
not
like
really, though, a single generation. The X1 was behind architecturally what the 8 Elite was doing. So yeah, it had room to improve. This is a CPU benchmark, so I've seen some people getting absolutely crazy, like, oh, did they improve their ray tracing performance so greatly? This is the same scaling roughly as you see. And yes, this is, by the way, a number that definitely comes with much, much higher power consumption on the X1 Elite. So the idea that they're just 33 and 26 watts here is ridiculous, but yeah, this is stupid.
hand-picked benchmark here into something more realistic like Blender, and the X2 Elite still runs all over the X1.
Also,
Elite,
one thing that actually shouldn't be here in the same way. Now, I know that Panther Lake is more efficient than Lunar Lake, but the difference shouldn't be that far away. Like, Lunar Lake should be this slow versus Panther Lake, but it at no point should be at that point using the same amount of energy. Maybe if normal, like now Lunar Lake only has 8 cores, so maybe it would be like 8 minutes, and then it would be with no amount of extra power consumption would it actually be able to get here. So unless you overclocked, you just overvolted it and gave it too much wattage, I'm not sure. Like, but these chips should definitely be using very different amounts of energy. Also, the Ryzen HX 370 being faster than the 388H. Again, this would be possible, but usually at much higher power consumption, and this is why I'm saying they simply did not test power consumption. If they claim they did, they're lying, because these numbers do not make any sense. If some might say, well, maybe they set their laptops to 30 watts. That's not really how laptops work. You can set it to like maybe a max wattage, right? Or maybe there will be like an average of like, oh, the balance mode is roughly 30 watts. But there can be peaks, there can be valleys that will be completely different. And yeah, in no way should Panther Lake here be less efficient than the HX370. It has more cores, so in something like Blender, it can actually spread itself better out. This is a 4 nanometer chip. This is an 18A based CPU. You can even see from things like from the single core test here, right? It has better single core results. And these single core results actually make sense. They actually line up with other tests, including Notebook Check and other numbers I've checked online. So yes, the power consumption testing here is completely whack. It's just completely wrong. Even if they tried to do something, they just did it wrong.
On this pre-production laptop, and hopefully it just gets better than that as drivers and firmware mature a little bit more.
You see, they're not even like, that's not always how drivers work, right? When you remember how like security mitigations work. With like Spectre and Meltdown, right? Those security mitigations actually came with a performance decrease. If you're looking sometimes at the highest end version that usually gets advertised before that, well, usually in order to reach actually acceptable battery life, there will be lower clocked, lower core versions, right? Like there's a difference between Strix Halo and Strix Point for a good reason. No, drivers are not going to be magical. And on a device that doesn't even have finished battery drivers, drivers. I don't know if they have already mentioned it in the video or they will mention it, but I did pre-watch this one. They said that battery drivers would not be out for a couple of weeks. That probably means that the actual device is probably at least like a month and a half away, which actually means that in the meantime, M5 Pro and M5 Max will come out.
as we get closer to launch. Now, I think this also highlights something very important from Qualcomm's perspective, because they have obviously delivered, even in the first generation, on the hardware side of the equation.
No, I mean, the GPU was garbage in the X1. I mean, single core was good because AMD and Intel were are really slumping in that regard, but in terms of Apple, they didn't come close. So I think this is just them breaking it all down. Yeah, this is the higher end version with 192-bit. What's interesting is that it still maxes out at 128 gigabytes of RAM. 192-bit would have been an opportunity to give it up to 192 gigabytes, but okay. Yeah, you see, so the highest end version has up to 192-bit bus, which will give it 228 gigabytes per second, which is of course faster than what Apple has in the M5. The M5 gives you this kind of bandwidth because it does have a 128-bit bus over 9600 megatransfers per second memory. If you want a larger memory bus, you'll go with M4 Pro, or to be more precise, at that point with M5 Pro.
In a lot of ways. It gets looking in 6-core performance integrated
so
GPU.
This is the actual lineup. So when it comes to things like the core count, you will see that there are a ton of cores here that are actually there are a ton of chips here that have the same max clocks. And one thing that I just wanted to point out, the 88100 maxes out at 4.7 gigahertz in single core, right? If you look at the X2 Elite Extreme, the 96101, right? Not even the 94101, which also maxes out at 4.7 gigahertz, you'll find you'll get less than a 10% uplift in clock speeds, right? 300 megahertz over 4.7. That's not 10%. And we are supposedly getting more than 10% uplifts. So no, I'm not inclined to really believe that one. I'm sorry. Now, yes, you have a pretty huge difference between max multi-core frequency with an exact 10% difference, but we were looking at single cores, right, where they were already a little bit short. And don't think that will actually fix it. So they have 6 performance cores and 12 prime cores. So just for comparison, what they call performance cores, everyone else calls efficiency cores, or in the case of AMD, it's Zen C cores or Zen 10 cores. What they call prime cores, now those are actually what everyone else calls performance cores. So Qualcomm is playing a little bit of footsie here with you, trying to confuse you. And yes, we are looking at 12 performance cores, which this is the number that the M4 Max actually has. That one actually has 12 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. So if you think that this chip exists to compete with the base M5, you're sadly mistaken. And the fact that this chip honestly gave you less than bint M4 Pro multi-threading performance, like this chip, right? Even if you add 10% on top of that, that's at best getting you close to matching the bint M4 Pro. That's come on, do you really think that they're doing this? Do you really think if this was 30 watts, that would be their maximum? If this was 30 watts, they would run this at 5.5 gigahertz, right? Because they could at that point, and they would reach 80 watts, and they would have numbers that actually match M5, right? At least in terms of single core, but they don't, because that's not the numbers they have. Benveni saying, I just saw on X, Apple released an iOS 26.4 carrier bundle at 12 p.m. Eastern time today. Apple usually does this on the day of an update, but since everyone saw nothing dropped. Well, I hope that if they drop 26.4, I'm not going to be motivated to upgrade my iPhone because, as I said, I actually want to give my iPhone in for repairs tomorrow. But I'll definitely try it on my iPad. That's not a big problem. Then we'll have a difference in total cache, obviously, from the lower from the versions with fewer CPU cores. Now, one thing should be noted that this one actually has the max amount of GPU cores because they call the GPU the same part number, the X290, and the max one is actually clocked only less than 10% higher. I mean, it's even actually a smaller upgrade than from the 4.7 to the 5 gigahertz here. Benveni, I'm giving in my iPhone to get the speaker crackling issue fixed because I did wait for 26.3 to actually see if there would be a software fix to it. But whenever I charge my phone and it reaches about 80 watts, 80% of battery, the speaker starts to crackle. And while it can be very imperceptibly silent, it can also be really loud, and especially recently. So I think that the speaker, as probably especially in the models with the SIM card tray, is built too close to the charger, and there is some static electricity. Well, at that point, it's not even static because there is actually an electric flow there. But it basically, the surfaces probably are close enough so that the charging port can actually transmit some power very, very lightly to the speaker. But because it's not a clear signal, it won't play a song because of that. It results in speaker crackling. And I'm sorry, I paid almost $2,000 for my 1 terabyte 17 Pro Max, bought even like an Apple case, bought a new MagSafe puck for my videos because my last one, that hinge mechanism broke. I'm just not willing to accept such an issue. I hope Apple replaces the phone outright. That way I also will get like a fresh new battery and things like that. But yeah, I'll let you know how it all goes tomorrow. But yeah, for the GPU, you'll also find, as I said, you do get the max GPU core count here. You just get a little bit more clock speeds on the X2 Elite Extreme. So don't expect a massive difference between the X2 Elites here versus the X2 Elites Extreme here, but expect definitely an uplift from these ones because they have a different part number for the GPU. So I assume this GPU has actually fewer cores, given that it would go hand in hand with fewer CPU cores. Blah blah blah, clock speed behavior. You see like 110 to 200 watts. If your numbers were actually able to be generated at 30 watts, there would be zero technological need to have a device that gets you to 110 or 200 watts. You can argue, oh, you get a DGPU, but even then you would probably, what would you pair with it? Like a 5070 Ti to justify that? Like when you look at 5070s, 5060s, those are all 8 gigabyte parts. They are not even worth getting over a Panther Lake system. So yeah, this is all silly. Blah, 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 a lot of graphs. They do then finally have some GPU numbers. You see, by the way, like speaking of Qualcomm propaganda, we spent like 80% of the video just explaining the chips again. They're calling this a performance preview, and they have like 3 benchmarks in the beginning and 2 benchmarks in the end.
The X2 Elite and Extreme drivers. I think the results, they really speak for the X2 Elite and Extreme. In some cases, more than double the previous generation.
So these are numbers from Qualcomm. I do not care about that. I want numbers that actually come from a reputable tester, let's look at what that has
And
to
in the test
offer.
that we've run so far, again, even on
So,
this,
by the way, any promise here about like 2x factor between in terms of performance? So, is the wattage here a limitation? Now they're testing Counter Strikes, but Counter Strike is also very CPU limited. So I'm just assuming that there is a hard bottleneck in like app translation from x86 to ARM here. Not good, but yes, if you do want to game, this is your current chip on Windows, right? Obviously, you can get a higher end system with a dedicated GPU, but get a Panther Lake system, you'll get best battery life. You actually get better drivers right now. Than most others with like really great 1% lows. And yes, if you want to save money, Lunar Lake is actually a pretty good system too. Architecturally, it's still better than the HX370. Now, it will have less raw performance in most games, so apparently not in Counter-Strike, but it does have better ray tracing. It does have a better upscaler with XeSS. It does have frame generation natively. It does have better AI compute, which obviously enables the better upscaler. So yeah, it's not even close, but get this one if you have the money.
pre-production unit with beta firmware and drivers. I think the results, they really speak for themselves. If the compatibility monster doesn't like...
So, and then we actually get tests where this one has 10 GPU cores, this one has 12 GPU cores, this is 8 GPU cores, I think this is 12? I mean, I don't want, or is it 16? Is the HX370 actually a 6? Now, obviously, those GPU cores are a very different architecture, but between Intel and Apple, there's actually some pretty predictable scaling with the core counts, not with AMD. That I'll definitely admit. HX370, which should be the same as the 470. GPU. Yeah, it's 16 GPU cores. So that one is also consumes just way more energy usually. So I could see this one actually being like maybe wattage limited, because usually the HX370 will get a bit closer, especially when ray tracing is disabled. But it should also be noted that Cyberpunk now unfortunately does not yet support Metal 4 with Apple's frame generation and Apple's RT-based denoising, but both on Apple and on Intel, it supports a native hardware-accelerated upscaler. For Apple, that's Metal, and for Intel, or Metal FX, I'm sorry, but for Intel, it's XeSS. On AMD, it needs FSR 3. It does not get access to FSR 4, which you will need an RDNA 4 card for it, like the RX 9070 and 9070 XT, or potentially a PS5 Pro. But yes, you can see here, by the way, like when we're actually looking at native games, now I'm not sure if Cyberpunk actually has a native Windows on ARM port, but it does definitely have a native version on Apple Silicon. You see that Apple actually outperforms the best integrated GPU. And I do mean the best integrated GPU, because technically there is Strix Halo that will give you like 40 GPU cores, but it exists in such a completely different realm of pricing and cooling needs, and it has low battery life. At that point, it's just a competitor to M Pro chips and stuff like that. And if you think about it, if you roughly double that performance, you're still about this performance level, right? One thing that you see here is that Apple's control over 1% lows, probably because Cyberpunk 2077 is a good port, but not yet a perfect port. Again, we are still waiting for Metal 4 support, some newer features, even better optimization. Hopefully by that point, we'll be able to have 57 average, maybe like 40 frames, 1% lows. But yes, here we have bad 1% lows, under 20. And here we actually see some of the scaling of like 80 to 90% faster than the previous X Elite. So I assume this is actually a native test, or at least one where the translation layer works almost as good as native, because we wouldn't see the same scaling. Though the 1% low scaling is definitely bad enough to be considering that. Also, this is with ray tracing off, and we know from the architecture in the A19 Pro versus the 8 Elite Gen 5 that Apple is currently way ahead of AMD and even to a degree Intel, but especially Qualcomm when it comes to ray tracing acceleration. This is, by the way, why I would love if they were actually to run a Blender benchmark with the GPU, which is how people actually use Blender.
Qualcomm in the butt again, then they have a bona fide competitor in the thin and light space when it comes to gaming. I mean, these results aren't earth-shattering in the grand scheme of things, and there's certainly room for improvement. But as far as the ecosystem is concerned, this is
and you will have like a 10% higher clock speed version, a 192-bit bus on the X2 Elite Extreme. So I would assume that that could help it get actually even close the gap to a degree, probably not overtake it. I mean, just 10%, like less than 10% higher clock speed, like 8% higher clock speeds. Let's say it even gets you up to 60. And then the 192-bit bus helps with some bottlenecks. But overall, one thing that does stick out here is that Apple's 1% lows are not that great in comparison to their average numbers. But overall, yeah, this is definitely an improvement over the Snapdragon X1 Elite, but you can also see that that was also desperately needed, especially for a chip that prides itself on efficiency and being an actual SoC that you don't need to pair potentially with dedicated GPUs. I would love to see actual like battery life comparisons or efficiency comparisons with Panther Lake at that point. Because like one thing that really sticks out here is also that Panther Lake doesn't really perform as much better as I would expect versus Lunar Lake. This could be because they put out some stupid wattage limit here, which might be working differently from device to device, because again, here we have a Lenovo, we have a Asus ZenBook A14, we have an Asus ZenBook Duo, we have a VivoBook S16, and we have an Acer Swift 14 AI. So even if you were to limit those devices in some ways, those limits will not work the same way. Like the motherboard, the display, everything will just consume power a little bit differently, and it will skew those results. So don't set those stupid limits. If you are going to set limits, then only do that to test actual battery life, because that of course will also depend on even things like, well, is the chip very hot? Do I need to spin up the fans a lot, right? Because fans might not consume a lot versus like a 100 watt hour device, but what about like a 50, 60 watt hour device that's like a handheld, right? All of those are variables. Some of them are less important than others. But yeah, also, man, if games were actually like natively built for Apple Silicon, it would just be the best SoC for any kind of handheld and stuff like that. I'm really looking forward to getting an M6 iPad Pro with a vapor chamber. That one could be absolutely killer. Like if it could sustain those performance numbers, doesn't even have to be higher than that, but in a thin and light iPad, plus with maybe some further architectural gains in terms of ray tracing and AI upscaling, that would be amazing. Maybe even limited just to like 40 FPS for maximum efficiency, because iPads don't have like the largest battery, of course. That would just be phenomenal in my opinion. And I think something similar can already be said. If you make a handheld with Panther Lake and you would limit something like this to don't forget, this is 1200p, you could run it more like at 800p on a handheld, limit it to like 45 watts, and you would have such a great user experience. Long battery life, still a very fluid experience. Baldur's Gate doesn't even need necessarily 60 FPS. It certainly doesn't need anything above it. So, man, Apple, please do something to make gaming better on the Mac.
Huge and very, very important leap forward. The same thing goes for GPU accelerated rendering in NLEs.
So, DaVinci Resolve. Why? Is this not using an image, not an image signal processor, but a video decoder? Man, Apple is in completely, like, the fact is, if you were to zoom in here, the difference here would already be pretty huge. Obviously, if you look at, because we have to zoom out so much, it just gets so much worse. It's 1/3 better. That means it's 50% faster than this one, than the old X1. I wonder, does it have any kind of better hardware acceleration? I mean, this is 4K H.265 422. Every one of these chips should have a native encoder for this. Like, you don't need to run this through the GPU. And now I'm really also wondering about the power consumption here. Plus, of course, Apple also has Final Cut. I know every one of these devices has stuff like Handbrake, but here, beyond obviously Final Cut, you also have motion and compressor for stuff like that are completely Apple exclusive. Like, at least with Final Cut, you could argue, well, DaVinci does a lot of the same stuff. And yes, you can obviously do motion and compressor stuff with tools like Handbrake and Adobe Animate and whatever. But it's just like, well, even then, Adobe Animate should be more powerful than Apple Motion, but I'm just saying that, like, there are more tools that you could use here, and especially with something now like Creator Studio being out, DaVinci Resolve was the obvious value. I would love to see even some performance tests between DaVinci Resolve and the latest Final Cut now. But none of that is really needed because Apple is already in a class of its own. We know that the encoders, I believe, got roughly 15 to 20% better versus M4, which means that M4 would also be better than all of them. And I'm not sure if there are any differences in encoding between Lunar Lake and Panther Lake. This might just be encoder plus GPU acceleration. But yeah, because the problem is, if this were just the GPU, right, then this would be embarrassing and, like, you should just throw it into the garbage. But I'm strongly believing that this is just an issue with hardware encoder support.
Boost given to the processing cores, memory, and graphics all combined to shave off almost 50% from the X1E's time, and that moves the X2E.
Yeah, I mean, it's 50% faster, but it shaves off 1/3 of the time, because that's how it works. To be 1 divided by 2 faster, you need to shave off 1 divided by 3 time, but that's math.
Into a really competitive position against AMD and Intel. And yes, look, where everything ends up falling throughout the rest of this year with the X2 Elite, X2 Elite Extreme, X2 Plus, and everything else that AMD and Intel is launching, well, we're just gonna have to wait and see. But what I can tell you at this point in time was released
really all? Yeah, okay.
patching.
So I broke down the numbers as much as I could, and the stream actually turned out over 2 hours long. Thank you to anyone who joined: Riley, Benveni, Rosa, Silicon Frame, anyone really. I know, like, my last video really underperformed in terms of raw numbers, but I still see the usual engagement, whether it's on Discord and stuff like that. So I hope you guys are okay with the community not being as big as maybe it once was, because the YouTube algorithm just tends to forget me whenever I don't do at least 2 videos a week. So if you want to see and hear more of me, join the Discord. I know Discord is also controversial now because of the new face and age verification rules, but hopefully you won't actually need that for my Discord channel, because we don't do any NSFW stuff over there. I know I've complained a lot about Hardware Canucks. Usually, I don't even think they do a really poor job, but honestly, I'm really pissed with how people are giving Qualcomm the benefit of the doubt. It just has always been at least like 5% overpromising, sometimes 10%. At worst, it was like 15% overpromising. And while that's not completely unacceptable, especially once you then combine that on a situation where Qualcomm has even less control, like at least on Android, it's launching on an ARM optimized system, but with Windows and API issues and app support and things like that. It's just completely different. You should not just be giving them the benefit of the doubt. And I also think you should really be here more acknowledging the fact, for one, that there is an uncompromised x86 solution that seems to be better in most ways. Again, don't forget that by running XCSS here, not only could you actually potentially get higher performance, but with much better image quality. And Qualcomm still, like, they have like Windows automatic SR or something like that, which really is like a post-processing filter that's completely inferior to FSR4, to XCSS, to DLSS4, and now 4.5, to Apple Metal Effects. So at least the temporal version, the spatial one probably comes close with the garbage quality of FSR3. Yeah, so I'm just trying to tell you there's still a lot that we don't know, and hopefully the one thing that I really made clear here is that these power consumption numbers are definitely not what you should be going by, given the fact that, again, battery drivers are still not ready for a couple of weeks after this video, given the fact that it's not even the highest end version, given that they've given really weird stats like, oh, all of these laptops used 45 watts from the wall. Yeah. In this case, believe me more than them, because I have zero incentive to lie. I don't make that much money from this channel, sometimes none at all, basically. And I certainly don't have a relationship with a company like Qualcomm, or Apple for that matter, to push out anything wrong, right, about it, to get you hyped or to get you unhyped or anything like that. I don't benefit from any of that. You guys know I have repeatedly said I want more competition for Apple, because that maybe will push Apple to give us a 12 GPU core, M6 or M7 or something like that. Maybe it will push Apple to use like an HBM-like memory solution that will give us even more memory bandwidth, but without consuming more power. Like, I want Apple to actually give us something for the higher prices they usually ask for. But as we've seen with the Galaxy S26 Ultra, Apple might not actually be asking that much more money these days than you might think, or than historically you would associate, especially with the exploding RAM and storage pricing, and with some of the shortages. Don't forget that. It's not just that this stuff is expensive. You might not even be able to get it, because Sam Altman from OpenAI just sat down with like Samsung, and it's either Micron or SK Hynix, and like secured like 40% of the world's RAM supply, at least in terms of DDR5 for themselves. Yeah, thank you guys so much. This was actually very fun. My voice actually held out. I will let you know how it plays out with my iPhone. Hopefully it all goes well. Hopefully Apple either repairs it or gives me a new one. I really hope they don't tell me you don't have a defect, because I definitely do. I try to record the crackling sound with like my iPhone XS, but it just doesn't work. Like the microphone on the XS, especially with how much dirt has accumulated over in that microphone, it creates always so much static noise. It always sounds like crackling when you like record something with it. I probably should have gotten like my mom to record something with her iPhone 15 Pro Max, and I didn't think to ask anyone at work, so we'll have to wait and see how it plays out. Again, guys, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, share the video out with anybody who you think might enjoy it, and comment. Don't just comment live, also comment afterwards in the regular comment section. It helps with the algorithm quite a lot. Join our Discord. You'll find the link in the description of this channel. Whenever you catch me live and want to support me, consider leaving a super chat or a super sticker, and you can also become a long-term supporter by becoming a channel member right here on YouTube, or a supporter over on Patreon. Shout out again to all our Mark Check Pro Max supporters. I hope to be back pretty soon. Maybe on Sunday, I'll make a video on my iPhone repair/replacement process. And hopefully with the coming week, I'll actually be able to talk about stuff like the iPhone 17e, the M4 iPad Air, the M5 MacBook Air, And maybe in not too distant future, we'll be able to talk about iOS 26.4, AI Siri. We'll be able to talk about the M5 Pro and Max MacBook Pros. So plenty to look forward to. Hit the notification bell. That way you actually know when I'm going live next. And I'll catch you then. Thank you so much. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.